Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Saturday. One guest tonight, the great General Jack Keane, for obvious reasons. But before we get to the General, you're hearing a lot of debate on TV. Actually, not a lot of debate. You're hearing a lot of people who don't know what they're talking about, even members of Congress. Members of Congress who swear to uphold the Constitution, who don't even know what's in it. Does Congress have the power to declare war or make war? Are they the same thing? You have a conga line, particularly of Democrat senators, particularly on the other networks, going on and saying Donald Trump has violated the Constitution. It must be true. I think I heard Adam Schiff say it. I think I heard Bernie Sanders say it, a man who's never really believed in our Constitution. But nonetheless, they go on and on. High dudgeon, moral outrage. Donald Trump is a dictator. He doesn't have the right to do what he did in Venezuela. He has to come to Congress. We have the power to declare war. It's not only them. The radical libertarians like Rand Paul, pseudo-constitutionalists, former federal prosecutors. Reminds me of the birthright citizenship argument, where they go on and on and on, except when you look at the history, you look at the facts, you look at the Constitution, those two words don't even exist, regardless of what the Supreme Court does, even if they're wrong. Okay, what's the power of the president versus Congress? You know, it would help if Congress actually looked at its own research. I have in front of me the Constitution annotated. It was created by constitution.congress.gov. I assume that means Congress. Now they got staffers. We pay billions of dollars for Congress. They do all the research. You've got the Congressional Research Service, all kinds of people. Not to mention the big networks and the millions and millions they spend on reporters. And just little old me at a computer. Let's read this. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. The Congress shall have power to declare war. And then it goes on. Grant letters of marque and reprisal and make rules concerning captures of land and water. But declare war. Now, we constitutional conservatives think the words in the Constitution actually mean what they say. So what does this mean? In its report containing the first full draft of the Constitution considered at the Constitutional Convention, the Committee of Detail that worked out all the details in the language included a provision granting to Congress the power to make war. Congress would make war. The assignment of this power to Congress and the clause's phrasing, which differed from its counterpart in the Articles of Confederation, prompted debate among the delegates. A lot of debate. It's in Madison's notes. Does anybody read it anymore? Charles Pinckney, one of the delegates from South Carolina, actually one of the most outspoken delegates at the Constitutional Convention, made the first remarks about this clause. He objected to including the House of Representatives in the power to make war because he believed it to be too large a body for the quick deliberations necessary for the task. Well, of course. The Senate alone, he said, would be the better option, Pinckney maintained, because it would be more acquainted with foreign affairs and more capable of proper resolution. Pinckney also argued that because both small and large states face existential risks from war, the composition of the Senate, 2 senators from every state, of course, equal representation, if you will, well, that makes it more rational, where the people would get behind actions that are taken. But his counterpart from South Carolina, Pierce Butler, he said no. He voiced an objection to either chamber of Congress being assigned the power to make war. Butler advocated instead vesting this power in the president, who will have all the requisite qualities and will not make war, but when the nation will support it. Now, why did he say that? Because the president of the United States elected by all the people, congressmen in a congressional district, senators by a state. The president's elected by all the people. He's the only one that represents all the people. But after Butler's comment, James Madison of Virginia, Elbridge Gerry, Massachusetts, 2 of the bigs, they moved to change the clause to give Congress the power to declare war rather than make war. So you have senators and congressmen coming on TV every day telling you that only Congress can make war, that a president can't make war, only they can, which is completely false. According to Madison's notes, the change was intended to leave to the executive the power to repel sudden attacks. Roger Sherman, another big, spoke in opposition to the motion, contending that Substituting the term declare would narrow congressional authority too significantly. Sherman argued that the original term make better captured the formulation in which the president was empowered to repel attacks but could not commence war on his own. And it went back and forth, and what did they do? They voted. They voted. Should we take out this word make and put in declare? The first vote is unclear from Madison's notes. The second vote is abundantly clear. 8-1. The delegations from 8 states voted to change make to declare war. One state said no. Where were the other states? They would come and go. Just the nature of the business that took place back then when men had to go home, take care of their families, their farms, and so forth and so on. 8-1. They changed the word make from declare. Now you know more than virtually every member of the U.S. Congress. Virtually every former federal prosecutor who's been on TV, all those pseudo-experts and pseudo-constitutionalists, you know more than they do now just by listening to me reading from Madison's notes. Now, what's the other problems with a declaration of war, a practical problem? You have 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate. Exactly how are they going to do this? Now, this was even raised at the Constitutional Convention, where there were 55 delegates, 39 voted for the Constitution. Obviously, their work had to be adopted by the states, and it was, but that's not my point. Even with a relatively small group, they said this is unwieldy. This won't work. Imagine what they'd say today with this Congress. Imagine what they'd say today. The filibuster rule. Imagine what they'd say today with a narrow Congress. And what else is a practical problem with this? Nuclear weapons. We have now hypersonic missiles. We have massive standing armies. We have nuclear submarines. In other words, things happen fast. We're going to sit around and wait to hear from AOC and Bernie Sanders? No, not unless we want to commit suicide. So this clause was never, ever to mean that you don't go to war unless Congress says you go to war. We know it from the original language. We know it from the constitutional debates. We know that it's illogical. That is insane, actually, to have a legislative body in charge of such an event. Why else? Who does the Director of National Intelligence report to? The President of the United States. Where's the CIA? Executive branch. Defense Department, executive branch. NSC, executive branch. State Department, executive branch. There's no way possible for one member of Congress, let alone 535 of them, to be read in so thoroughly and comprehensively about what's going on, to even know what's going on. The President of the United States is read into this stuff multiple times a day. He's the executive branch, which is why under the Constitution, he's the commander-in-chief. He's in charge of foreign policy. Now, you might say, but Mark, they didn't explicitly give this power to the president. No. And why? Because they were concerned about a president that would become too powerful. But what did they do about that? They didn't give the power to Congress. What does Congress have the power to do if Congress needs to do it? Anybody? Anybody? They have the power of the purse. They can cut off funds for any branch of the military or for any major military operation if they can get the votes. Now, the president can veto it, so it really has to be a significant position of Congress in both parties. If that's what they want to do, that's what they can do. In 1973, they gave it a shot. They passed the War Powers Act. It's not actually an act, it's a resolution, utterly unconstitutional. Now, why is the 1973 War Powers Resolution unconstitutional? Anybody know? Because you can't amend the Constitution with a resolution or a statute, can you? No, you can't. And what does that resolution do? It basically gives Congress a veto power over the president. Congress has no veto powers under our system. Congress has no authority to veto a decision by the judiciary or by the executive. It can cut off funds. It can impeach a president, has to have a supermajority to remove a president, but it has those powers if, in fact, the body politic and Congress as a significant whole really believes in these things. But you cannot have Congress involved in initial decisions like this, and moreover, we now hear some Republicans even saying, But if we're going to authorize troops and so forth and do that sort of thing, the president has to come to us. He doesn't literally have to come to you under the Constitution. You can stop him through the power of the purse, but you have no authority over battlefield decisions, over decisions about maneuvering, over positions about assets and resources and where they're going to go and where they don't go. I'm sorry. I know a lot of people don't like this. That's our Constitution, and it's worked damn well since it was ratified by the states, hasn't it? Now, let's talk about declarations of war, okay? We've had 11, 6 of them during World War II. 6. Why 6 during World War II? Japan attacks us on December 7th, 1941. On December 8th, we declare war against Japan. Immediately after, Germany and Italy declare war against us. We reciprocate and declare war against them. That's 3 times right there. During the course of the war, a year or so later, we declare war on Bulgaria, Hungary, and Romania. Why? They're Nazi-controlled, and they're at war with us. So that's 6. When else? Let's go back to the beginning. We have the War of 1812 when the British were imprisoning our sailors. That was a declared war. We have the Mexican-American War in 1846 when there were battles taking place on the border, and John Polk, who was a great president, in fact, said we need to declare war and went to Congress. We have the Spanish-American War in 1898 when they sunk the USS Maine in the Havana Harbor, and the result was war then too. And in World War I, we declared war twice against Germany and the Austria-Hungary Empire. That's it. We've had hundreds of battles. You can call them wars. Most of them weren't. Although the Korean War was a war that was not declared, that was under the UN flag. The Vietnam War was a long and bloody war. That was not a declared war either. But Congress had the power to cut funds off. And in the end, that's what they did in Vietnam. They cut off the funds, and that was the end of that. So I just want to make things clear about how things actually work. Now, one other thing. The Monroe Doctrine, or what we now call the Monroe Doctrine, and it ought to be called the Monroe Doctrine. Why? Because I remember the senator, then turned Secretary of State, the buffoonish John Kerry, he announced one day on his own, he declared, we no longer honor the Monroe Doctrine. Now, he had a word salad, but I'm just cutting to the chase. The Monroe Doctrine, he just declares, forget about it. Now, it's named after President Monroe. What's that all about? Well, let's take a look at this. This is the National Archives. The Monroe Doctrine was articulated by President James Monroe at his 7th annual message to Congress on December 2nd, 1823. The European powers, according to Monroe, were obligated to respect the Western Hemisphere as the United States sphere of interest. He must have been a neocon. No? A warmonger? No. He said, look, anything that goes on in our hemisphere is our business. Now, this is even before, cutting-edge technology, the ability to move forces as quickly as we do, obviously planes and jets, and they never had any of that. But he saw the foresight. They'd been through war, and a lot of wars up to that point. He said, we have to be able to anticipate or to act early on to prevent our country from being attacked. And these European powers are all over our hemisphere. So therefore, I'm declaring we have a right, my doctrine, to deal with it. Of course, John Kerry didn't much care about that, did he? The Monroe Doctrine was invoked in 1865 when the U.S. government exerted diplomatic and military pressure in support of the Mexican president, Benito Juarez. Now, this support enabled Juarez to lead a successful revolt against the Emperor Maximilian, who had been placed on the throne by the French government. Wow. 1865. See, we had dictators all along. No, we didn't. If you listen to these people on TV today, these senators in Congress, and some of them Republicans, that go on and on about Donald Trump's acting outside his lane, he's absolutely not. This is 100% consistent with our history, with the Constitution, with our law, with our tradition, with our practices of prior presidents. Almost 40 years later, in 1904, European creditors of a number of Latin American countries threatened armed intervention to collect their debts. Well, who was president in 1904? They messed around with the wrong president, just as they mess around with the wrong president today, Donald Trump. President Theodore Roosevelt promptly proclaimed the right of the United States to exercise, quote, an international police power to curb such chronic wrongdoing in his so-called Roosevelt Corollary, or an extension to the Monroe Doctrine, which is now the Donroe Doctrine, because the Monroe Doctrine had been destroyed by John Kerry and his ilk. In 1962, the Monroe Doctrine was invoked, symbolically, they say, but nonetheless, when the Soviet Union began to build missile launching sites in Cuba, and with the support of the Organization of American States, John Kennedy threw a naval and air quarantine around the island after several intense days with the Soviet Union. They agreed to withdraw, and so forth and so on. And I can go on. Our history is laced with examples like this. Very, very important. So everything you're hearing about these actions in Venezuela, which isn't even a war, compare that to the Vietnam War, to the Korean War, and some of these other military actions and wars. It was a military action, and there may be other military action, are fully within the power of the presidency, contemplated to be within the power of the presidency. And these, mostly Democrats, but some isolationist, pacifist Republicans, and we've always had that strain in the Republican Party, who are out there saying, look, I'll vote the president to go ahead now, but if he actually puts in troops and so forth, he has to come to Congress. No, he doesn't. You can try and cut it off. He doesn't have to come to you at all. Since when do you have this power? Where is this power written? Where is this power provided? Who gave it to you? Who gave it to you? Don't tell me the framers. I just told you they took it from you before they even created you. They changed make to declare. So what is this declare power? It's more psychological than anything else. Congress, we declare war. Let me ask you a question, just to further underscore for the fifth or sixth reason why they're wrong and I'm right. Let's say Congress decides on its own to declare war. You know what? We declare war against Botswana. Excuse me? Oh, yes. War against Botswana for whatever the reason. Does the president have to comply? Of course not. Does Congress have troops? Of course not. Do they have any element in the military? None. Maybe the Capitol Police, but I don't believe they are part of the military. So Congress never had, can never have, will never have that kind of power. Even in parliamentary systems that don't have separation of powers. They get votes from the parliament to support and so forth, but in immediate actions of war and so forth and so on, the prime minister makes those decisions, whether it's in Britain or Israel or other places like that. But we are unique for a good reason, which is why we're the #1 superpower on the face of the earth, assuming we can keep it that way. President has the power to make war. Congress can declare war, but that doesn't make war. Congress can demand authority to make subsequent decisions. That's not based on the Constitution. That might be based on certain practical political considerations, but that's it. The President of the United States is conducting himself within the four corners of the Constitution and precedential activity by other presidents. Absolutely no question about it. Now, if he sent 400,000 or 500,000 troops, which he won't, peace through strength, that's his view. He's not an interventionist for interventionist purposes. Then he'd be Lyndon Johnson, wouldn't he? I just don't remember the Democrats getting all this worked up about the declaration of war when Barack Obama was bombing the hell out of one country after another. I just don't remember it. Maybe my memory's gone. I don't remember it. I don't remember it when they took out Gaddafi in Libya. Hillary Clinton was all excited about that. I don't remember them arguing about declarations of war. Because the Democrats, if they're anything, they're completely two-faced. And Republicans, whether they call themselves libertarians or not, who are undermining the president at a time like this, shame on them too. The country should be behind them. And I think most of the American people are behind the president of the United States.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.